the end of the Jaipur Literature Festival, 5 days of great literary fun. And I have with me William Dalrymple. Well, remember, in the festival, no topic is too difficult or too ticklish to approach. So, of course, I'm going to ask William some rather ticklish or maybe controversial questions about what's happening in the world today. William, as a historian, not just as a director of the festival, but as a historian, the world is really in turmoil. I think today, perhaps more than any other time. How do you see the expansionist impulse? I mean, you've written about emperors and invaders. You have a very deep sense of history and a sense of why expansion happens, what invaders do, what's the impulse. So how do you see, in some senses, Trump's regime ruling?
Well, speaking very much personally, not as a director of the festival, empires rise and fall, and periods when everything seems to be very calm and the waters are still in the lake are often the times when trouble is brewing. I direct a podcast called the Empire Pod, and our subject is the rise and fall of empires. And while this festival was going on, we were recording for the Empire Pod a series on something called the Bronze Age collapse. And it's this extraordinary moment in antiquity when all the empires around the Mediterranean, Mycenae, Troy, the Hittites, the city-states down the eastern coast of the Levant, all in a period of just maybe a decade and a half, these mighty empires that have been clashing against each other and rumbling around for thousands of years collapse in as little as 2 decades. And so I think we've got to be aware that history that tells us that things are very unstable, and you never quite know when the trouble will come. And it's like, the famous story of the butterfly flapping its wings, creating a storm in some other part of the globe. And I think definitely the period of stability in Europe that we've seen since the end of the Second World War, and even more so since the fall of the Berlin Wall, is definitely now drawing to a close. I am no fan of Donald Trump. I think very few people outside the Republican Party anywhere in the world are fans of Donald Trump. And it's slightly like one of those sort of fairy tale stories where a mad king is sort of sitting, thumping the table. There are many parallels to people like Trump in history.
Historically, who would you compare him to?
Henry VIII is somebody, a bit like that. Henry VIII is perhaps slightly more responsible than Trump, but and so perhaps better educated. But you do get these figures with enormous, fragile egos rising to positions of power. This is common throughout history, and they can behave extremely erratically, and particularly if they're surrounded only by sycophants and only are told what they want to hear and enclose themselves in their own little bubble. They behave very erratically. I think what he's doing with Greenland, with Venezuela, and with Gaza is extremely dangerous for world peace. There's absolutely no doubt that just unilaterally going without even approaching Congress and kidnapping the president of another country, however rotten that president is, to threaten allies of 50, even 100 years standing with tariffs because they won't hand over a sovereign territory. This is close. This is beyond parodies, but to the point of madness. And all my educated liberal American friends roll their eyes and feel the shame of this madman running the show. And then we have obviously a very dangerous period in history when China is on the rise. And all the systems that mankind has built to contain violence, to limit war, to promote human rights, these are threatened by actions such as these. And if we enter a world where dog can just eat dog, which is actually the norm during history, and we hope that we'd evolved out of this and created institutions like the United Nations, like the statutes of human rights, international law. These are things that limit arbitrary, whimsical banging on the table by rulers who are not constrained by democracy or law.
And they're forming their own peace club and inviting the other countries to be part of
and
it.
Gaza is a more catastrophic case still, where how can we, 75 years after India won its independence, initiating the whole post-colonial period, how come the Palestinians can just be treated like savages who do not deserve representation and the right of self-determination like any other people on earth? India has led the way with recognizing the Palestinian state many years ago, and India has a very good record with looking after the rights of the Palestinians. My own country, Britain, has a terrible record and is responsible for this mess in the first place.
But if you just come to Iran, because you have traveled there, and it has a Sufi past, it has many multicultural layers. How do you understand Iran today in the context of its history?
Well, what happened in 1979 at the Iranian Revolution was a very extraordinary thing, which was that in the course of a whole series of uprisings with many different peoples involved in this, communists, left-wing, Republicans, the old tyrant, the Shah, got kicked out, and the revolution was hijacked by the Ayatollah and the mullahs, and another autocracy replaced the first autocracy. But I mean, it's an extraordinary event in 20th century, 21st century history that we can have a very rich oil-producing country, which would be one of the most liberal countries in the Middle East, and also difficult to imagine today, but then the richest country in the Middle East, richer than Saudi Arabia, richer than Qatar or Dubai or any of these places, could go back to the rule of black-robed mullahs looking for all the answers in the holy book from the 7th century, the 6th century.
Isn't that surprising, and doesn't that hold true for most of West Asia? You've written about the Sufi traditions there, the tradition of humanity, whether it's in Pakistan. You visited the great Sufi shrines. How did this, how did the change happen? It's become so radicalized.
I wouldn't look for answers in Sufism so much as it was I think the recourse to fundamentalist religion was a response to oppression, to desperation, to marginalization. People who are oppressed, who are facing the guns of soldiers, the secret police, torturers, were looking for salvation, and many conservative villagers found it in the mullahs. But what happened was that the mullahs, who were often at the time regarded as a stopgap, a figure which the country could rally about in the absence of the Shah, took over and became more oppressive than the Shah had ever been. And what we've seen in Iran over the last 3 weeks now has been horrific degree of bloodshed, masses. I mean, I think the official figure is something like 3,000, but there are reports that maybe as many as 20,000 if you go outside Tehran into places like Mashhad and Isfahan and Baluchistan. There are figures being bandied around of possibly 20,000 dead in a very, very short period. So something utterly horrific has happened, and this regime has its back against the wall. It thinks it is divinely appointed and is taking whatever measures it feels necessary to protect itself. And I'm very, very fearful. I've today been with one of the authors at the Literature Festival whose brother didn't come back from from demonstrating. And they didn't know whether he's been arrested. They didn't know whether he's one of the people in body bags. And I saw this poor girl, this very distinguished author, weeping in the author's lounge only half an hour ago. So no, this is a great tragedy. And happening at the same time as the tragedy of the Palestinian people, and at the time that the Venezuelans are in this odd position of having a sort of colonial government imposed on it, the people of Gaza having an odd colonial government imposed upon it, and the possibility of Greenland having a colonial government imposed upon it. These are things I have to say that we've dealt with all these three areas in the Empire Pod, and I advise anyone that wants to know the history behind this to look up. We did 26 episodes on the history of Iran. We did, I think, 9 episodes on the history of Greenland, if you want to know the extraordinary Viking history of that country. And we just recorded here at the festival 2 further episodes on the people in the streets of Tehran now calling Javed Shah, long live the Shah, a complete mirror image in reverse of what they were shouting in 1979.
Very interesting. You talked about Greenland's Viking history, but Trump has his eyes on Greenland. So if you look at it from the post-colonial lens, because you've written a lot about post-colonialism also, how do you look at that? His eyes on Greenland, his threats to Europe.
Well, it's the end of the post-war order for the time being, as long as Trump is in charge and his MAGA government. Again, we have these safeguards in international law that stops one country just invading another, or is meant to, that stops random abductions of the presidents of country. We have systems of law whereby the president's meant to consult Congress, and we, for the last half century, UN resolutions, the whole method whereby the Security Council and the United Nations can limit random conflicts taking place, and then the UN steps in with UN peacekeepers to limit such conflicts. This is being replaced by a kind of bizarre board of peace, as it's called, whereby people can pay $1 billion reportedly just to join. And which the Palestinian people, who have suffered so much at the hands first of the British, then of the Israelis, have no representation at all. How could that possibly be right? How can that possibly be acceptable? So I am absolutely no fan of what Trump is doing, and it makes me extremely anxious.
Thank you so much for that. I think, William, if the Vikings were still around, perhaps, history would be different. At least what's happening in Greenland might just take a different,
I'm not sure
dramatic...
the Vikings are going to be any better than Trump. But in fact, I'm sure one could make some parallels between the two. But,
yes, that's true. That's true. Thank you so much for speaking to us, William Dalrymple, in conversation with NDTV.